I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning for this Discover Nature webinar, Emerging from the Ashes, How Fire-Shaped Communities Are Responding to the Tubbs and Kincade Fires. And I am Holland Gistelli. I'm Education Specialist at Pepperwood. And Pepperwood is a place where researchers and community members come together to tackle some of our greatest environmental challenges. We are a nonprofit organization based on a 3,200 acre preserve located in the Mayacamas Mountains of Northeast Santa Rosa. And Pepperwood's mission is to advance science-based research throughout our region and beyond. We use the preserve as our living laboratory and educational campus, and the Dwight Center facility serves as our classroom space, lab, gallery, and office spaces. We strive towards our mission through three critical program areas: research on climate, water, plants, wildlife, and we use that research to better inform decisions about how we care for our environment. And then education, so programs such as this one, and others for all ages, from children to teens, college students, and adult learners, and everyone in between. And community. Our volunteers contribute directly to our mission through active community science projects and stewardship, and we are also very grateful for the support of our members and donors. And a little background on Pepperwood itself. The land was once a ranch owned by Kenneth Bechtel, and when he died in 1978, he donated it to the California Academy of Sciences. At that time, the Academy operated it as a field station for many years, until they were looking to renovate their museum in Golden Gate Park, and they needed to liquidate some funds. And at that time, Herb and Jane Dwight created the Pepperwood Foundation. So it's an independent nonprofit, and they used that to acquire the property in 2005. And then the Dwight Center for Conservation Science was constructed in 2010. And ever since then, we have hosted over 25,000 visitors, from scientists to students, families, researchers. And the preserve itself encompasses a wide range of habitats, home to an incredible diversity of plants and animals, over 900 species. And it's easily accessible to students, scientists, and nature lovers. So we hope that someday in the future we can see you there in person when we can all be together again. And without further ado, I will now introduce Michelle Halbur, our presenter today. Michelle has an MS from Purdue University and oversees Pepperwood's community science and visiting scholars programming, as well as managing a multitude of our on-site research projects, including long-term grassland and forest monitoring, plant phenology, breeding bird surveys, the Stephen J. Barnhart Herbarium, and much more. Michelle also helps to translate Pepperwood science for a variety of audiences, including students, interns, and the public, which you will get to experience today. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it on to Michelle.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here with everybody. Even though it's virtual, it's really nice to be able to meet together and to be able to share what we have been observing over the last few years. And today my goal is really to give you a high-level perspective on the impacts from two back-to-back wildfires, the 2017 Tubbs fire and the 2019 Kincade fire, which we just had almost a year ago, and really just give you a sense of how nature is healing, and as well as how our community is healing. And as Holland mentioned, I will be able to take your answers at the end of this presentation. And for those of you familiar with Pepperwood, this is the first meadow you see when you come to the preserve. This here is our barn meadow, and this is what it looked like the spring following the Tubbs fire. All right, let's hope my PowerPoint responds. There we go. It always makes me a little nervous. So we really consider ourselves a living laboratory. Holland did a great job introducing, the unique diversity of the preserve. We are located in between Santa Rosa and Calistoga in the inner coastal mountain range of Northern California. And what this means is we're a location that is on the eastern boundary of the fog belt. So we get we get coastal influence, and we do get fog in summer months that really help cool off those hot days. And then we also get a lot of interspecies, species that are more adapted to dry conditions. And along with the complex topography out here, we have a lot of different species and vegetation communities, and it lends itself to be a laboratory to explore how climate change is impacting our Mediterranean terrestrial ecosystems. And we view ourselves as a sentinel site. This is a term that was coined by NOAA Fisheries in regards to how climate change is impacting sea level rise or wetlands and estuary impacts. And we're taking that concept into the uplands, into the terrestrial ecosystem. And basically what this is we're serving as a sentinel on the watchtower. We are monitoring and watching how our environment is changing and the response of vegetation, wildlife, and also setting up alert systems so that as a human community, a part of our natural community, how can we best respond in these emergency situations such as flooding or fire that we've been experiencing. And California, especially Northern California where we are going to experience a lot more frequent and more severe fires in our future. In fact, it's already happening here locally in Sonoma County in our region because of conditions becoming more arid, and there's also a fuel load increase that's been happening that I'll discuss later on. So here's a map of the preserve, and this is a map showing you some of our research locations. So being a sentinel means we have a lot of monitoring stations. We've got lots of plots that we visit on a regular basis, whether we're looking at breeding birds, whether we're checking wildlife cameras to see what mammals are using the space, or counting grasses, etc. There's a lot going on, and this is just an example of some of the research stations that are out here. Let's see here. So I'm going to move into talking about the North Bay Fire Complex in October 2017, specifically with regards to the Tubbs Fire. And then I will go through kind of the impacts that we saw from the Tubbs Fire. But then I'm going to revisit the Kincade Fire and show you how the Kincade Fire might be a little bit different in what we're experiencing and observing compared to the Tubbs Fire. So for those of you from our region or beyond, a lot of us were personally as well as professionally impacted by these fires that occurred in early October of 2017. And these fires were visible from space, as you see in this image. There was the Pocket Fire to the north here, the Tubbs Fire here in the center, and Pepperwood is this green blob right here, and the Nuns Fire to the south. This image here is facing east towards Mount St. Helena in the background here. In the foreground is the Dwight Center, and I'm actually sitting right here today. And I love this image because it really gives you a sense of the complex topography that's out here, the variety of vegetation communities, as well as the mosaic of impact from the fire itself. The Tubbs Fire ignited at the base of Mount St. Helena here and moved towards us in this image. That was the very first night of the firestorm. And what I want to point out here is there's this hill right by the Dwight Center that we call the Grouse Hill. This is a mature Douglas fir forest that has been completely top-killed from the Tubbs Fire. But just to the north, you can see a patch of living trees that are intact. And that can serve as a refugia for wildlife and for plants that can then serve as propagules to reoccupy these neighboring areas. So there really wasn't this wall of fire that you may think of, moving as one force through the landscape. Instead, what there was there were high winds that were distributing embers all throughout this region, sometimes miles in advance of the main fire front. And you got a bunch of spot fires. And when you hear people's accounts of fleeing this area, there was fire moving in all directions and at various times. And the result is this kind of mosaic of impact that you see here. And one thing I want to point out too, oops, let me go back, is that grasslands is a community, an ecosystem that's adapted to disturbance and requires disturbance to maintain itself as a grassland. And following fire, grasslands are typically the first community to come back and germinate. So moving into some of the history of this region, this location that we occur in the Mayacamas mountain range is a very well documented fire corridor. There has been a regular fire interval or frequency of about 50 to 60 years, as far as, going back into about the 1850s, since people started settling in homesteads throughout the region. The map to the right, the red boundary you see is the Hanley fire from 1964, and that is almost identical to the Tubbs fire that just occurred in 2017. However, there's unique differences among them. The Hanley fire took 3 days to move from northeast to southwest, whereas the Tubbs fire took a few hours. There were only about 100 structures destroyed and no lives lost in the Hanley fire, but sadly the Tubbs fire, we lost over 5,600 structures and 22 lives lost. And as I mentioned, many of us have been personally impacted from this fire. I unfortunately lost my 2 in-laws to the fire, and so you can talk to anyone in our community, and the real tragedy here is the loss of lives and homes, not so much the ecological impact. And I hope you come away today with a renewed appreciation for our California landscape and how resilient it is, and how it can provide a space for healing and resilience in our personal communities as well. So since we have all this equipment out on the preserve, we were able to basically, gather the data that was left on the data loggers that remained following the fire and were still functional. So whether they were temperature loggers or wildlife cameras, and we pieced together the story of how the fire moved through our landscape. So as I mentioned, the fire started in the northeast and moved towards the southwest on the first night that the Tubbs fire came through. And so the front part of the preserve down here, this is the preserve entrance, if you're familiar with it, in the Dwight Center right here. This area experienced a hot, fast-moving fire that first night. And then we determined that it took about 3 days for it to slowly move through the preserve in this direction. And that initial event was a wind-driven event. Those kinds of fire events are pretty much impossible to prevent. The conditions are right. Wildfires will happen under those conditions if you have an ignition source. And so really all you can do with a wind-driven event is try to mitigate or slow it through your land management activities. And then we call this other slow-moving fire or more surface fire that followed the following few days as a landscape dominated or determined fire, topographically driven fire. And I should point out that the Tubbs fire burned 90% of the preserve except for this upper corner here and this lower corner here. And this is called Hendley Flat. I'll refer to that with regards to the Kincade fire. And this is called Garrison Canyon. This is an area down here that has not burned, or excuse me, since the Kincade fire, it hadn't burned in about 100 years. So I'm going to show you some images from our wildlife cameras. This is from one that is right by the Dwight Center in some serpentine chaparral. And this is the first night of the Tubbs fire. It's actually early morning the following day at 2 in the morning. And within a matter of minutes, the chaparral was pretty much consumed. And 45 minutes later, there were still really high winds, and you can see a lot of these embers sparking and spreading essentially throughout the area. Compare that to the next evening around 5:40 in the evening. This is further north on the preserve, more of a topographically driven fire, and what you get is this more surface level fire, so low to the ground, slow moving. It took 10 minutes to reach the camera in this one versus just a few minutes. And you don't get the upward movement through ladder fuels to the canopy here because there's a nice gap between the forest floor and the upper canopy. And this is the kind of fire we want. We want these ground surface fires to come through areas that have lots of development of thatch, litter, duff on the forest floor, and it cleans up that forest floor, releasing nutrients, removing pathogens, allowing the, actually cleaning up that physical material that's there, all the leaves and sticks, so that if acorns or other seeds drop to the forest floor, those seeds can actually come into contact with the soil layer and germinate instead of having to try to penetrate through, sometimes inches deep layers of material. Sadly, we weren't really prepared for a wildfire. None of us expected the Tubbs fire to come through. I've been an ecologist at Pepperwood for 9.5 years now. And before the Tubbs fire, I used to walk the landscape pointing at trees that had fire scars, showing where chaparral was, talking about the importance of fire in the California ecology. But I never imagined I would experience it firsthand. And unfortunately, that meant that our equipment wasn't ready for a wildfire to come through. We lost a lot of research equipment. We had batteries and plastics that melted, so really toxic materials. Our wildlife cameras did melt, but some of the SD cards inside survived, so we were able to, get some information from these cameras. We sadly lost our historic barn, which had all of our research equipment and vehicles in them, and we lost 2 residences. We're very, very grateful that the people occupying that space they were able to flee, but they did lose all their possessions. Right now, we are in the process of rebuilding, and our barn is almost complete, as well as one of the residences. And so we're finally, almost 3 years later, ready to come home. And those buildings, I should say, we're using this as an opportunity to utilize renewable resources and materials that are less toxic in case they burn. They're also fire resistant. So we're trying to demonstrate how you can live with fire, because it's not a matter of if a fire will come through, it will come through. So it's a matter of when and how we can mitigate that. So moving forward, I'm going to talk to you about just the impacts that we saw from the Tubbs fire, and then go into how we're watching our ecosystem recover over time. The days after the Tubbs fire, everyone's lives were disrupted. We woke up one morning and things were completely different, and the whole community was in turmoil and trying to figure out how to respond to this emergency. We were in an evacuation zone, so we did not have access to the preserve for weeks. Although some of us, like our president, Lisa McKaylee, the preserve manager, Michael Goley, they were able to get up here with the sheriff escort to assess damage and to also deal with the cattle that we had on site. So really, it was a time of anxiety, anticipation, uncertainty, and we didn't really know what we would find when we got up there. When we did get up there, it was a moonscape. Everything was black, and there were no rustling weeds or grasses, no scurrying lizards, no birds, no traffic from nearby. It was silent and eerie. It was a very different place, and none of us really knew what it would look like come spring. This is an image from Google Earth. If you're familiar with the preserve, this is Three Tree Hill right here. And this section that you see in tan is a location that we had conducted a prescribed burn the spring prior to the Tubbs fire to control for an invasive grass called Medusa head. And what you see is that area, because we had done a prescribed burn the previous spring, it had no material there to burn. And it actually served as a fuel break and a refuge for wildlife, including our cattle. We had 200 head of cattle on site at the time of the Tubbs fire, and they fled to the burnout zone of our prescribed burn area and survived the fire. So prescribed burns are really good for creating fuel breaks. They help, in fact, CAL FIRE has told us now twice that our prescribed burning and fuels management programs really help them gain a foothold in controlling and mitigating and managing these fire lines. What we see in the landscape following fire is you get a lot of these trees that have like these ashen silhouettes, and we call these ghost trees. A lot of these are either dead or ailing trees, material that might already have been on the forest floor that burns really, really hot and creates these kind of ashen silhouettes of where the tree once was. Those locations tend to burn really hot. And so this is an image of where a log or a tree had fallen while it was burning. And it burned so hot that it actually changes the chemical composition of the soil and kills off a lot of the organic material that's in that soil. And what you get is sometimes you get hydrophobic soil, so the waxy materials from the plant tissues will deposit on top of the soil after it burns, or the ash itself is hydrophobic. And that's a concern for, runoff. So if there's heavy rain events where there's high burn severity, you might get too much runoff, creating flooding or debris flows. But in little local areas like this, what you see is you actually see a benefit from the burning of this material just adjacent to that bare soil. Do you see this green kind of ring around that area? This is where all those nutrients that was tied up in that plant material, nitrogen, phosphorus, gets deposited, and these plants are definitely benefiting from that. They grow lush and green. You'll often get heightened biomass in those areas, and thistles. Thistles really like this area as well. And then over time, these soils can regenerate and eventually become reoccupied with vegetation. And the USGS was really interested in this question, and so throughout our region, they collected soil samples and they ran what are called infiltrometers. These are just little percolators essentially that drip water, and you time how fast it moves through the soil column to get a sense of hydrophobicity. And what they basically found, this graph here is not going to go into detail of what it's saying, except for there is an upward trend. So basically we saw soil recovery within a year's time, which is good news. In areas that there was a hot, fast burning fire, we see what we call leaf freeze. These are areas where I should say, these leaves here were actually on fire. And I know that because it's black. We call that torched. If it was heat-killed material, the leaves would be like a little tan color. And I'll show some pictures of what that looks like later on. But I know in this area, the fire was very hot and moving fast. And it basically froze these leaves in the direction of the fire. And fire ecologists will use these as clues on the landscape to get a good sense of where the fire was moving, how fast it might have been moving, and to determine kind of the behavior and the characteristics of that fire. What I found really interesting is that fire unveils the landscape. So it removes this material and it shows you things that you didn't see before, like giant rocks. I knew these were there, but I didn't realize how many were there or how large they were, because they were always veiled, with grasses that in the way. We see rocks that shattered under extreme heat from the fire, like these rocks here. We see old artifacts from the homesteads, in the 1800s, 1850s. This here is a redwood stake that didn't burn, but it stayed here. It's been here since, the early homesteaders. So we have known vineyard rows on the preserve. You can see the topography. If the light is just right, you can actually see those vineyard rows from a distance. But we saw a lot of vineyard stakes that were still remaining. We did see animal bones. We did not see any real evidence of animal mortality from the fire, however. That was one thing we were really concerned about, and actually I was a little scared to go out and see what it would look like. But how I know this was not killed by the fire is that a lot of these bones were already scattered before the fire by scavengers. So they were not entire carcasses, and parts of these, the animal skeletons were neighboring this one here. I don't know if this is evident, but we saw, you can start seeing game trails. So it's almost like a ghost trail in a way. So this pathway here became obvious just because the materials nearby burned, but the path was trodden and did not burn. Rodent trails become evident. And one of the first signs of life we saw were gophers. Man, the gophers are out there really busy following a fire, churning those soils, going after their understored caches for food, and getting those nutrients to move through the soil column. This image here is really great in showing you what that leaf scorch, so the heat-killed leaves, look like. These trees were not directly on fire, at least in the canopy. They might have been a little bit on the trunks, but it's hard to tell from here. Here's one of those ghost trees I mentioned. You can see the white ash, but it also shows there's a nice mosaic of impact here. These are mostly coast live oak, black oak. It's a mixed hardwood forest community that is very well adapted to fire and is recovered really nicely. Now, when we started going back up to the preserve, I was able to get access, I want to say 3 weeks after the fire came through. And as soon as we saw the green grasses come up, we all could just take a big breath and relax. It was almost like that green, that green color was a sign of hope. Now, as an ecologist, I know these are all annual invasive exotic grasses, but I still was really happy to see them, and I was starting to look forward to what the spring was going to bring. Within about, I would say, 4 to 6 weeks after the fire, those trees that had experienced the leaf scorch, so the heat-killed leaves, these tan ones you see, all of a sudden started putting out new growth. So we see young leaves. Here's a male catkin or flower stalk here emerging, and this doesn't normally happen this time of the year. So it was definitely in response to the fire. Trees that were completely, what we thought, top killed, they had no leaves left, completely charred black, all of a sudden came back. This is a coast live oak, again, in response to the fire. Black oaks are highly adapted to fire, and here's one that is stump sprouting. So some of our Mediterranean species will stump sprout at the base. This is one of my favorite photos because people always ask me, what is this going to look like in 50 years? And I can point out, this is California Bay. These are the stump sprouts after the Tubbs fire. And what it's going to look like in 50 years are just like these tall blackened stalks. These are the stump sprouts that grew into trees from the Hanley fire in 1964. Now, we cannot age this individual because it was burnt in the Hanley fire, stump sprouted and grew small trees. It's been reset with the Tubbs fire, and who knows how many times that's occurred for this individual. So again, another Mediterranean species that's adapted to fire. And our area in California is rich with fire-adapted species. I should say that the cultural history here is rich with fire as well. So Native American burning was quite prevalent on the landscape, and those burning practices reaped a lot of benefits that I'll go over, throughout this presentation. The chaparral started to come back, I would say, 8 to 10 weeks after the fire. It was a little bit later than our oaks and other hardwood communities. This here on the left is toyon stump sprouting as well as chamise. And chaparral is our shrubland communities that you see. These are shrublands that are most often found on south-facing slopes that experience a lot of fire. Our Pacific Coast redwood, even though we're up in the hills, up in the mountains, we have redwoods here. We are in the coastal fog belt, and these redwoods are hardy. They are adapted to more arid conditions than right along the coast, and they are adapted to fire. Really thick bark, lots of tannins in them, and they are them and tan oaks like profusely stump sprout after a fire. Immediately send up stump sprouts and continue to put them out throughout the season. They also have what's called an epicormic growth response, which is just growth along the trunks. So these are trees that burnt all the way to the top. And what happens is there's these like dormant lateral buds under the bark waiting for a fire to basically burst them into life, so they grow out from the trunks and will eventually replace the branches that once were on these trees. And then redwoods also germinate following fire here. So this germination brought on by fire can, if this tree seedling survives, which it may not, but if it does survive, it contributes to the genetic diversity of this species. And we have Michelle Geary might be on this presentation visiting with us, and she has a bunch of community college students that are working with her to look at impacts of local climate on germinating redwoods at Pepperwood post-fire. In areas that were charcoal black, we see it come to life with this bright orange fire-following fungus called Pyronema. There's a fire-following moss called bonfire moss that's really brilliant. And I just learned that it's actually one of the world's most common mosses. So if you ever go to a campfire pit and you see some moss growing, it's probably this one. And it turns a nice rusty orange as it dies back. Some of the first wildflowers we saw come up are called geophytes, which are basically plants that have underground storage organs like corms, bulbs, tubers. And this here is death camas, which is appropriately named. It's highly toxic, but it's just a lovely wildflower. We started seeing evidence of woodpecker activity. Lots of pileated woodpeckers and other woodpeckers going after the beetle larvae underneath tree bark. And we were curious, how did our newts and other sensitive species that go dormant in our summer months, these animals will go underground to stay cool as the summer months heat up and dry down. And our newts were apparently doing fine. They started emerging right away after the fire when the conditions, became more moist and cool. And our western pond turtles came back the same time they normally do every year, just before Valentine's Day in Turtle Pond. That spring was absolutely spectacular. So with the removal of all that thatch and litter, the recycling of those nutrients into the system, we get a burst of photosynthetic activity, and the wildflowers come as well. These are two poppies, cream cups and California poppy in our barn meadow. Lupins, which are nitrogen fixers. They put nitrogen back into the soil. Blue-eyed grass and goldfields. And here's those geophytes. So these white flowers here that you see, that's the death camas. And then this kind of blue-green plant you see here is wavy-leaved soaproot. These are plants that you commonly see throughout Sonoma County and the region, but you don't see them in numbers like this. And so they are responding directly to the fact that now there are nutrients, there's access to light, and they go into this real reproductive response following fire. We saw that with Diogenes lanterns. And fire creates space. So when fire moves through, sometimes it'll burn roots into the ground. So these are root holes. There's a large trunk kind of where I'm standing taking this photo. And these roots burnt into the ground, creating burrows for wildlife, but also just a year, I think this was taken a year and a half after the fire, there's already ferns and mosses occupying this space. So these little, micro refugia for cool species were immediately occupied. Here's a tree that burnt that, a year following, there's been some bird deposits put in here, and now it's an upcycled planter box. We also had, these photos are from 2 years after the Tubbs fire. We had a rare plant called redwood lily or chaparral lily come up in numbers we've never seen before. I counted over 90 individuals. And in that same location, we saw bear grass bloom for the first time in decades. And bear grass is not a grass. Grasses are wind pollinated. And this has showy petals. And I love this plant. It just makes me think of Dr. Seuss. It's so surreal. So the spring following the Tubbs fire, we knew it was a very important opportunity to get out there and explore the preserve and document new species that might be following the fire, specifically plant species in this case. And so we hired a bunch of botanists to essentially go on a treasure hunt through the preserve. And they found 12 new species to our flora. They found 8 what are called post-fire endemics. So these are plants that require fire to germinate and then are found, growing 1 to 2 years after the fire. So these are plants that remain dormant as little live embryos inside of seed coats underground for 50, 60 plus years, waiting for smoke, heat, and all the chemicals that react when a fire occurs. And that bursts them into life so that they can have genetic, reproduction and gene flow, and then go back as a dormant seed bank. Post-fire specialists are the same as endemics in this case, except they're often seen a little bit further along in the succession. So a little bit after 1 to 2 years, sometimes 3 to 5 years. And post-fire opportunists are those common plants like the soaproot, the death camas, that we see in small numbers, but take advantage of the fire and are seen in large numbers. And we found 2 new species of that category. So some of our post-fire endemics are Brewer's redmates here on the top right. That is a rare plant. Hairy suncup, Venus looking glass, California mustard, catchfly, rock rose, Torrey's cryptantha, whispering bells. This is a photo from Sugarloaf because they had a huge, beautiful patch. Our patch was small, but I'm very proud of it. And then our specialists, so these are the plants seen a little bit longer than 1 to 2 years after a fire, are Griffin's bellflower, blue-toed flax, mock parsley, and skullcap are the opportunists we found. So unfortunately, in with the good, in with the bad, we also had an influx of invasive weeds, and we're still kind of observing how those trends and trajectories are, what course they're taking over time. But one of the first things we saw that was kind of interesting is this plant called stinkwort, which is relatively new to our region in Sonoma County. It is an invasive weed, and for those of you that don't know, invasive weeds tend to be plants that take over areas and can threaten ecosystems. They can actually change entire ecosystems. And we do manage for these weeds at the preserve. We had a handful of invasive weed or patches of stinkwort throughout like our road system. They really like gravelly areas such as our freeways. You'll see it along our Highway 101. And after the fire, we saw it sprinkled everywhere. We found it all throughout our forests, our chaparral, and this characteristic was regional. This impact was regionally experienced. And my thought is this plant is in flower late in summer, so it's actually coming up right now in August, and it goes into flower around September or so and is in fruit or seed in October when the fires occurred. It is related to a dandelion, so it has fruits that are very similar to dandelion that disperse in the wind. My thoughts are with the high winds as well as with the uplift of the heat and smoke, and then the downfall of the ash. Those seeds were most likely distributed throughout the region. Now we're watching this plant because we obviously can't go after it because it's everywhere. So we're watching it and seeing how it responds to, plants moving back in. Maybe it gets overcrowded or shaded out. And then where we do find patches that become established, we're going to go after them and hand pull them. This is a picture not from Pepperwood, but from my commute to Pepperwood nearby in an area called Fountain Grove. And this shows a mixed hardwood forest that's been completely top killed. However, you see regenerating bay trees throughout here. And then this green carpet is an invasive plant called French broom. And all of the brooms really have this response to fire where they build up a really prolific seed bank that can stay in the soils for 70 years plus. So they're ripe when a fire comes through. They love that disturbance. They all germinate and create this monoculture, unfortunately. And here we are, 3 seasons after the Tubbs fire, and it still looks like this. There's some self-thinning, but not much. And unfortunately, these plants can grow into, really woody shrubs that are fire prone. And this is how it looks for miles, unfortunately. So it's a real issue. And these species crowd out natives, they reduce biodiversity, they change things like the fire regime or fire risk. So it's a real concern, especially when you have homes being developed right next to this. One lesson learned, we were going to be doing a prescribed fire in October 2017, our very first forest prescribed fire, but the Tubbs fire beat us to it. And this is a location, this image on the left here, we had put in our hand line, so our fuel break for the prescribed burn. And we had basically taken the topsoil and moved it aside. So we had a bare mineral soil line to stop the prescribed fire. And unfortunately, what happened is during the Tubbs fire, it burned hot on both sides where there was just the typical material, but didn't burn hot along the fire line. And along with our, soil disturbance, it actually enhanced weed growth. So all those seeds survived the Tubbs fire, and it became a seed highway, mostly with this burr that is common in this area. It's an invasive plant called tall sock destroyer. And neither me nor the wildlife appreciated it. It was really bad after the fire. So I'm going to move into how some different plant communities and animal communities appear to be recovering following the Tubbs fire. And as I mentioned, grasslands are one of the first communities to come back and germinate following fire. So we knew immediately we needed to go back to our annual monitoring locations. Grasslands are one of our most invaded and actually it's one of our most threatened ecosystems in California. And it requires a lot of management to do things right, to steward those native bunch grasses and wildflowers that require disturbance. So we heavily manage our grasslands through prescribed burning, invasive weed management, as well as through our grazing program. And we utilize our grassland monitoring project as part of our adaptive management of the preserve. So every year we visit 32 locations where we lay down a transect line and we monitor the same locations in space year after year. Look at that information and then kind of recalibrate how we manage the following year. And these are just some images from one of our locations. This is a serpentine grassland, which serpentine plants tend to grow fairly stunted. So this is really what a typical grassland looks like in this kind of soil type. One thing I want to remind you is, we recently experienced a multi-year drought. We've also had 2 historic water years and then 2 historic fires. So there's been a lot of disturbance in this area, which really, I cannot advocate enough for people getting monitoring stations on the ground right away, because we are in the midst of climate change happening now. So if you can get your equipment out there, then disturbance will come. And so being able to have a baseline data set pre and post fire, pre and post flood or drought, that is absolutely critical for long-term research and really understanding how our ecosystem is responding to these disturbances. So I'll get off my soapbox and go back to the grasslands. So looking here at this, what we call a photo point. This is a permanent photo and monitoring location. Here it is in the grassland during the drought. You can already see they're drying down, and these are taken at the same time each year. Here's after a historic water year, we have more plant growth. After the Tubbs fire, there's all those rocks I was talking about. And then the spring following the Tubbs fire. So at grasslands, we have a really fast recovery following fire. We have perennial bunch grasses in California. You can see them coming up here. These are purple needlegrass or Stipa pulchra. And these native perennial bunch grasses are really what we're trying to promote with our grazing and our burning. These plants are amazing. They can live 50 plus years. They have really deep root systems that tap into groundwater that allow them to survive the hot, dry summer months with no rain for months. And that's why they're greening up here. They have access to groundwater. They're perennial, so they live for many, many years. And they come up after fire with vigor because they have those nutrients. They don't have the thatch, shading them out. They're very beneficial for our grassland ecosystem. One of the things we do with our grassland monitoring is we look at above ground productivity. And we basically lay down this little rectangle and give the grassland a haircut. And then we separate that material out by this season's growth versus previous season's oxidized thatch. One thing we don't want in grasslands is a buildup of that thatch because, like I mentioned, it shades out natives and reduces biodiversity. It's also a fuel hazard. And what we see from year to year, the light green bars are the fresh material weight. The tan color here is the thatch or oxidized previous season's growth. And over the years, our grazing management has been able to reduce the thatch weight that you see here. But after the Tubbs fire, we saw a significant reduction. We also saw the most fresh productivity following the fire because of all those nutrients. And that fresh material lays down immediately and can reestablish your thatch layer the following year. So it's really important to manage what we call our fine fuels, these herbaceous plants following a fire. Because one of our main questions we had was, this whole area is black. It's a moonscape. How will it come back? Will we have enough forage for our cattle to come back? What will it look like? And through our data and our observations, we were able to say, no, you need to bring cows right back because they can help manage that material. So here's an image with an exclosure where we keep the cattle out and we do have a monitoring transect inside. And this material was dense following the fire. We did bring the cows back in May after the fire and we moved them really quickly through this area so that it allowed there to be enough material remaining to prevent erosion in the following rain year, and also keep some forage on the ground in case we needed to come back to this location. Now comparing rapidly recovering grasslands, and I did not go into any of the biodiversity data. We have a lot of grassland biodiversity data that we're going to analyze, but compared to grasslands, forests take a lot longer to recover. Here is an image of the road to Grouse Hill. To my untrained eye, when I first saw this, I went, oh man, this is a high severity burn area. But in actuality, if you're a fire ecologist, this is more of what they call a moderate burn severity area because there's still standing trees, right? You still have twigs and sticks. If it was high severity, you wouldn't see that at all. And here's what it looked like a year later. So even though here they look like they might be dead, again, these are adapted species to fire that have experienced fire for tens of thousands plus years, especially with all of the cultural burns that were taking place within our region. We have madrone regenerating, bays, tan oaks. There are ceanothus seeds here. These are seeds that require fire to germinate, and they were in the roadbed waiting for the fire. In coastal California, we have a story where if you remove fire from the landscape, you're going to have native plants behave invasively, such as this Douglas fir here. You're going to have an accumulation of fuels build up. So Douglas fir is a native tree that it can reproduce rapidly if there's no fire. So it sends out a lot of seeds that germinate quickly. They grow fast up through the oak canopy. They will crowd each other out, killing each other off. They'll overtop these trees and shade them out, then kill everything underneath and reduce the biodiversity of one of our most diverse communities in California. On the left here, we did hand thinning to compare. So we came through with hand crews and removed the Douglas fir, behaving as though we are a low, surface level fire moving through the area. and enhancing that oak woodland. One of our main objectives at the preserve is to support or enhance the biodiversity of the preserve, and so by doing this, we're sticking to our goals. And this is what it looks like. What happens is by bringing all this thick material down to the forest floor, you're left with a lot of material on the ground. And given our Mediterranean conditions with hot, dry summers and cold, wet winters, that doesn't lend itself to have a lot of microbial activity to have decomposition, right? So a lot of this material sticks around a lot longer than you would find elsewhere. And unfortunately, if that stuff stays on the ground, it burns very hot. This is an area where we had done Douglas fir thinning. There was a lot of material on the ground. There was no ladder fuels that would carry the fire into this canopy. Instead, what it was the material on the forest floor that burned so hot, it then moved that fire into the canopy, killing these huge, beautiful black oaks. And it's just heartbreaking when you witness this. So for us, the take home was you got to get out there. You have to bring down these high fuel loads, reduce the fuel loads in the forest by bringing down these Douglas fir trees, whether they're alive, or in this case, now we're removing dead standing fuel, bring it to the forest floor, and then the following year, follow it with pile burning, prescribed burning at a frequency that's ecologically beneficial, or other methods. We had been doing what's called a lop and scatter method, where you just cut it into small pieces to try to promote decomposition, but it wasn't enough given how much fuel we had. So here's an area where we had planned to do that prescribed fire. That weed highway I showed you was this line here that we had carved into the ground. And we had set up 9 plots to monitor prior to the prescribed burn, so we could just see how successful we were or not, some lessons there. But we weren't able to come in here because the Tubbs fire beat us to it, and the Tubbs fire burnt this area a lot hotter than had we gone in and done that fuels management on the forest floor. In the top left, this is the spring prior to the Tubbs fire. You can see all that material in slash on the ground. Right after the Tubbs fire, top right, most of it was consumed. These leaves you see are from heat kill. The canopy was heat killed, as well as some deciduous trees that naturally drop their leaves after the fire. The following spring, we have some regeneration. There's a lot more light now coming in because of the canopy kill that occurred. But then the second spring following the fire, man, do you get a lot of herbaceous growth. And that was a surprise to me. I'd never witnessed that. And we're really curious, these trees are going to take a long time to regenerate because a lot of them have to come up from the seedling stage. And they're going to take years to reestablish these areas as forests. But the dynamics of the herbaceous species are going to rapidly evolve and change from year to year. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens on the forest floor. Some of our plots, we had dead standing trees that completely were consumed. There's a hazardous tree here in the back that you can see slowly moves lower and lower to the ground. And so what we're seeing is that conditions now in our forests are much more dangerous than they were right after the fire. You have delayed mortality, and all that woody, all those dead trees, their structural integrity is degrading, and trees are falling faster and more frequently now than they were right after the Tubbs fire. We had bay saplings, small trees seem to just disappear, but then come back up from stump sprouts, and we'll be monitoring those over time. Areas with lots of large debris, 1,000-hour fuels, if you're familiar with that term, on the ground, burned really hot. And you see that here, no vegetation, like I showed in a previous slide, but then that area became occupied by invasive thistles. So not a fun place to work, even though I may look happy here, hiking through acres and acres of this to monitor is just not pleasant. And we were curious this year what it looked like. With the pandemic, I was not able to reoccupy our monitoring sites this spring, but I did slip out there to take some photographs. And, instead of these chest high thistles, they were underfoot, which was much more pleasant. They were still present in high numbers, and this low growth most likely has to do with the fact that we had a winter drought. So there's still seed out here, and we're going to see how it changes from year to year. There's also native pioneer species, so species that will move in after disturbance. This is a horseweed that's native to California, way taller than me, probably a good 9 feet tall, 8 feet, 9 feet. And then here's volunteer Peggy Rockwood collecting some for our herbarium as a voucher specimen, because it's the first time we documented it here at the preserve. And so there are some native species that will move in prolifically following disturbance and kind of help secure the soils and regenerate the area. So one of the things we look at in our forests are things like, stump sprouting. How many do they put out? How tall are they? How fast do they regenerate? And some species like redwood and tan oak here, you can see in January, the blue lines, and in pink, this is August. They immediately send out their stump sprouts and continue to do so throughout the year, whereas others are more delayed, like your maple, black oak, and blue oak. They were more delayed and they didn't put out as many. So we can document, regeneration rates of individual trees or species. We can look at seedlings and mortality as well as regeneration. So how are the demographics changing in our forests? For instance, we went from 350 coast live oak seedlings in our plots down to just a handful. Whereas big leaf maple increased after the fire. We're seeing more of them in our plots. And manzanita all of a sudden showed up. So manzanita seeds were dormant in the seed bank, brought there by coyote, birds, or maybe they were there as, the shrubs that were there before it became a forest community. We're looking at things like biodiversity, so how many different types of species, and how much cover do they take up in these plots from year to year. Before the fire, this tan refers to the leaf litter on the ground, so a lot of leaf litter before the fire in our forest plots, and not much herbaceous or wildflower growth. But then following the fire, we had a lot of native forbs. In fact, we doubled our species list from before the fire and in just 1 year following the fire. So a lot of different species popped up, like these native clovers you see down here. And the second year following the fire, what we see is the invasive weeds take over. So that's the thistles especially that you see there. Here's a black oak that was burnt out prior to the Tubbs fire, but was hit really hard with the Tubbs fire. In spring, after the Tubbs fire, we didn't see many stump sprouts. Here's 1 year later and 2 years later. So we can start documenting, is this tree gonna ever become a tree again? It is being eaten back by the deer. They love black oak stump sprouts. It's also being impacted by powdery mildew. There's a disease that comes with fire, and all the new growth the spring following the Tubbs fire on coast live oaks and black oaks were hit really hard by this powdery mildew. So if you're someone thinking of a master's thesis, this would be a really good project to determine if these, if this mildew actually does respond positively to fire. To me, it's pretty obvious, but we need to actually document it. So looking at how mammals recovered, a lot of people ask me, how did the animals fare? And on some of the cameras that we still had data for, really we saw wildlife movement pretty much right away. We are in the process right now of writing grant applications to get funding to do this work, to ask those specific questions. How did the mammals do pre and post fire? And now that we've had 2 fires, how are they going to do given a second round of wildfire? This is from the camera at the Dwight Center where I showed the fire moving through the chaparral, and just a day after those fire images were collected, we have a deer moving through right here. Here's a deer a few days later with some embers, still smoldering. Jackrabbits. Cougar a few days following the fire, or puma, mountain lion. Coyote. Firefighters mopping up, checking the fuel break lines. We got bear about a month later. Now we can't say if bear left the area or not. We need to look into this statistically. It could also be a relic it could be an artifact of the fact that our cameras in forests in particular were the ones that were hit the hardest and weren't recoverable. So it might just be a data gap because we have, you know, a void. We didn't have a camera in the areas where the bears were, but we need to look into it. It's a really important question. And with the Kincade fire, because of our experience with the Tubbs fire, we were able to harden a lot of our infrastructure, and we were able to save a lot more of our cameras and have more complete information. There's a beautiful bobcat and a porcupine in January. So this is a site where we had not seen porcupine before. And we're thinking, you know, porcupines have a small home range, and in winter they love to eat Douglas fir bark as one of their food sources. And this area burnt pretty heavily. So perhaps this guy was on the move looking for, you know, more suitable location for foraging. We're not really sure, but we were very excited to see it. Moving to birds, we do have an annual survey where we, during the breeding bird season, so April through June, we have volunteers go to these dots that you see on the map, and they basically stand there for 5 minutes and count how many birds they see or hear. And they do that 3 times each season. We've been doing this project since 2007. And the big question we had was, gosh, how did the birds do after the fire? Year by year, this is just the number of species of birds we've detected among the years. And after the fire, we actually had an uptick compared to the previous year. As far as the total number of birds, it was comparable. So we did not see an immediate impact or reduction of bird activity following the fire, but this is all birds lumped together. You can start seeing, you know, different trends if you start asking, you know, these questions of individual species. So here is a lazuli bunting, and this is a known fire following species. We had not detected it 3 years prior to the Tubbs fire, but after the Tubbs fire, we saw more than we had ever seen before, and that maintained its abundance into 2019. I should say that in September, myself and my colleague Nicole Barden are going to be giving a breeding bird lecture, and we're actually in the process of entering and analyzing the 2020 data. So if you want to see what's going on with lazuli buntings after both a Tubbs and Kincade fires, come check it out. Western meadowlarks are ground nesting birds, so we're really interested in this bird with regards to our grazing program and impacts of that program and our prescribed fire program. And we were curious, you know, how did they do after the fire? And they look like they're still on their kind of upward trend here. This trend is a statistically significant increase from year to year using a linear regression, if you're a science statistician nerd. California towhees, wren tits, and California quail are all birds that really like that more dense shrub cover in our chaparral. And our chaparral converted from high dense cover to no cover in a matter of a day. So we were really curious, how are these different species responding to the fires? And the towhees don't seem to be affected by it. Wren tits were already on a downward trend. They may have more of like a sinusoidal curve to them. So maybe they're following like a predator-prey curve or a pathogen curve. We're not really sure what's going on here. But this just shows you, this is a long-term project. You know, we have, 13 years of data here, and we still don't know enough of what's going on, what the trends are. And so long-term monitoring is very critical for understanding species responses and trajectories to climate change and to our management. California quail were doing great during the drought. We're also coming down prior to the Tubbs fire and are continuing to go down. I'm really curious how these guys are doing this past spring. Okay, moving into the Kincade fire. So this is taken from Three Tree Hill looking north towards our neighbor's property on the Bald Hills. This fire came at us from the northeast. And one of the biggest differences here with the Kincade fire is that we knew it was coming. We had time to prepare, as well as all the firefighting agencies. They also had time to prepare and hold a line against it. This map here shows you the Tubbs fire footprint and the Kincade fire footprint here in pink, with the overlap being orange. And the Kincade fire burnt about 60% of the preserve, including Hendley Flat and Garrison Canyon. Again, this is an area down here that probably hadn't burned in well over 100 years. And here's an image taken by our rancher who had the forethought. You know, he's been through a fire before. His cattle were out in this area, and the day before this, he moved them all to the front of the preserve, which was basically saved them. And at this point in time, he realized he needed to also get out. There were upwards of 7 bulldozers operated by CAL FIRE and local fighting agencies at Three Tree Hill to fight the fire. They decided to stage the firefight at Pepperwood because of our extensive road network, but also because they knew it was a place that was managed for fuels, and so it would give them an advantage. And unfortunately, this results in some ecological impacts that we now have to, you know, mitigate and restore. So they really, it was a battle up there. There were a lot of lines that were cut into sensitive ecosystems, and we are ever so grateful that they did fight the fire, right? There's no question about that. Our own homes were being rebuilt. Our neighbors' homes are being rebuilt. People still haven't moved back yet. And the devastation of having this fire progress into the wildland urban interface would have been very devastating. However, now as stewards of the land, now we take the torch and the baton, and we need to move forward in restoring these landscapes. And also working with these firefighters and other land managers to have a more comprehensive landscape level fuels management plan, so that on a landscape level, not just parcel by parcel, but on a big picture level, we can help slow these fires, reduce their rate of spread so that we can gain a foothold. And also, I should say, open space is a place for these fires to go. It's a place for them to go to naturally burn out and to reap the ecological benefit that we see from them. There's bulldozer lines in forest communities, on slopes. And one of the biggest things for us is, you know, we were facing 15 linear miles of bulldozer lines in late October. So the Kincade fire came through Pepperwood, I think, on October 28th. And we knew the rainy season was coming. We had to move fast. We had to make a lot of decisions. How do we control for erosion? How are we going to restore these areas? There were some sensitive habitats that were impacted. And what we opted to do, I mean, we had thousands of volunteer hours donated. It was really remarkable how our community came together to help us pull this off. So within weeks, we opted to pull all that topsoil that the bulldozers, you know, shoved to the side, pull that back to bring more material onto these dozer lines, to bring the seed bank back, to try to help promote growth. And we also used planting plugs that we had grown from seed that was collected on site and propagated on site in some of our most critical areas. And to me, this is what resilience looks like. It's, you know, our community coming together to support landscape level function and diversity, and for all of us to really have those ecosystems intact, because we all benefit from these ecosystem services. Here are some pictures from the Kincade fire. We were allowed to go back on site after the Kincade fire a lot sooner than the Tubbs fire, so we saw, you know, still smoldering trees. And that's why these images look a little bit more, you know, drastic, is because they still have the ash, whereas the Tubbs fire, weeks later, some of that material disappeared over time. This is what we call a grandmother tree. It's a large valley oak in Henley Flat that unfortunately perished from the fire. But I have to admit that even after seeing this with the Kincade fire, I wasn't as in shock as the Tubbs fire. So the Tubbs fire was much more of a dramatic shift because none of us had been through it before. We had no idea how well it would recover, how beautiful it would be. And to see this, I went, no, you know, it might be okay. A lot of these plants and animals, they're going to be okay. We don't know the impacts of back-to-back fires, however. You know, there's a lot of trees that might have been weakened from the Tubbs fire that were heavily hit by Kincade, and that's what we're working on right now. We're reoccupying all those sites that we had in place. where we have pre and post Tubbs fire information, and now we can go back and start asking those really important questions. Here's Garrison Canyon, which hasn't burned in well over 100 years. And here it was in spring. So it was a mature Douglas fir forest mixed with all these gorgeous manzanita, old growth manzanitas. And it'll be really curious to see how that recovers over time. Here's Diogenes lanterns coming out from, I love this. It was this old charred, gnarly rooted, I think it's an oak with a little bit of soil here, and out pops this brilliant color. Here's some pre and post pictures. So we had nice recovery this spring. And I know I'm up for time, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. We did hire Nomad Ecology to conduct some chaparral surveys for us after the Tubbs fire. With the pandemic, unfortunately, we weren't able to get them back on site this past spring to reoccupy areas that burnt in the Kincade fire, which are these locations here. However, I hopped out here and took photos. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. This chaparral to the right burnt once in Tubbs, and on the left burnt twice. And what you see is in 2.5 years after a fire, you have great shrub recovery. And in places that are burnt more frequently, unfortunately, what you have is a conversion to grasslands. Remember, grasslands require disturbance to stay grasslands. And we're seeing that throughout California, especially Southern California, where their fire frequency is increasing. And they're losing a lot of their biodiversity on a landscape level because a lot of these chaparral areas have species that are, again, adapted to fire. So where you find those fire followers that I showed you earlier occur in places like this. It's a very temporally rare community. So they might be widely distributed with great numbers. So they're not technically rare as we classify rare plants, but they are temporarily rare. And to remove fire from the landscape has threatened those individuals and those populations. So, and also too much fire can threaten and hurt those populations. So we're really thinking about how we can best steward, these temporary communities by getting in there, getting rid of invasive weeds, and other ways that we can support the diversity of our chaparral communities. Here's the area that was able to recover after the Tubbs fire. Right away, you have, within a couple of years, you've got brush at 4 feet high, lots of cover for animals and wildlife. A lot of animals love this. We have seedlings here. So these are chamise seedlings that germinated from seed, so contributing to the genetic diversity of the population. But in the twice burnt area, these are the same chamise plant. I didn't see any seedlings in this area. So any seedlings that had germinated after Tubbs were killed. And unfortunately what that does is it kind of depletes the seed bank that's there. And for those plants that require fire to germinate and don't stump sprout, you lose a lot of that diversity. Here's the chamise burnt twice that is still coming back. And here's one where these sticks, these larger branches you see here are from ones that were burnt in the Tubbs fire. These thinner ones are the stump sprouts from the Tubbs fire that were burnt in the Kincade fire. And then down here you see the lush green growth from the Kincade fire. So you just get that evidence of those back-to-back fires and how they impacted these individuals. And so we're asking a question of how much fire is too much? We are actively doing prescribed burning in our grasslands to control for weeds. However, if you have too much disturbance, it will favor other weeds like storksbill, narrowleaf clover. This is an area that used to be dominated by native perennial bunch grasses, and now we're seeing weeds because it's experienced a lot of fire in the past 3 years. How will the land recover from our bulldozer lines? How will the land recover from these fires? We do have some grassland transects where the bulldozers went through our plots, and so we're going to be seeing how they recover over time. How will individual species or species communities respond over time? And then how can we help build fire resilient communities? So not just ecological communities, but the human community as well. And how can we work together as a community to better steward our landscapes? So we're working with lots of different people within our region. We're funded by PG&E to create an online toolkit for the public to get science and fuels management information into the hands of local landowners. We've improved fuel data sets. We actually developed a ladder fuels map and model with Ag and Open Space and NASA. And this is what it looks like. It basically lets you know how much ladder fuel do we have locally or in the region, where can we prioritize our fuels treatments, how can we go in there and collectively create advantageous fuel breaks, for example. So we're going to still continue fuels management on our property. It is more critical now than it ever was. We have a wildfire camera at the preserve. We were the first in Sonoma County to have one go in, and since then there's a ton going in, and it's really remarkable. You can go online and see what the views look like live, and these cameras allow agencies to triangulate and position, find where the wildfires are, do better resource allocation. So instead of calling all forces in every time there's a wildfire called in, you can actually look, observe, and determine how many resources you need to allocate to those fires. And here's the Kincade fire. I watched the Kincade fire come through Pepperwood on one of these cameras. And the camera, it looked very dramatic, but the camera did survive, which was nice. And then we're all about working with our community, coming together. One of the strengths of Pepperwood is really serving as a hub, again, where the community and scientists and decision makers can all come together, have these conversations, and use science to drive our decision making. So we held a symposium in May of 2018. Those resources are available online, and they're still pertinent today. And I highly recommend you check out what's there, because it's, again, not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We should all be prepared, and we're in fire season right now, so let's all be diligent. And the outcomes ecologically, again, fire is very healthy for our landscape. Fire is needed on our landscape. And how can we best, steward that relationship without having the devastating impacts that we personally experience within our communities? These are all wildflowers in response to the Kincade fire this past spring. All right, and with that, I thank you very much. I hope you learned a little something. I'm sure I forgot a couple of things, so feel free to ask questions, and thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you, Michelle. That was super informative. There were bits and pieces in there that I hadn't seen yet, which is really exciting. And yeah, I just want to share a couple questions and comments from the chat before we wrap up for today. One question that came in was, do we know what caused the Tubbs fire? Was it PG&E or natural causes? And I think I know the answer to this, but you may know this, Michelle?
So I do know that it was being investigated, and I may not be the most informed. What I last heard was that it was some faulty electric work, and from what I've heard, again, I may not be accurate, is that PG&E is still assuming liability for the Tubbs fire. Is that what you've heard, Holland?
Yeah, I had heard, the last thing I remember hearing was it was under investigation, and an initial conclusion was that it was faulty power or electric on a private property, and whether or not that was PG&E, I think, was undetermined at that point. Yeah, so I don't know. And then we also heard from someone suggested, said, thank you for a very informative presentation, and Pepperwood's research is critical to large land managers in our area, particularly East Bay Regional Park District, as well as East Bay MUD, Municipal East Bay MUD, that's the water district there. And just a request, please share your research with them and make this recording available to them as well, because they are near heavily populated urban communities.
Yeah, so one of our biggest objectives here is to get our data public and to share it. Of course, we are hard at work, and I kick myself, gosh, 2 weeks before the Kincade fire. I said it out loud in the office. I said, I'm so glad we're finally out of emergency response mode and we can get moving forward with all of our work. And boom, we were hit again. So as we all know, science takes time, and we're working hard. We're trying to get models to people. We're trying to get things into the public hands, and that requires funding. So if you guys know funding sources, please help us out, especially during this pandemic year. But we are all about sharing and collaborating, and when those products become available, we will definitely get them to you. Thank you.
Great, yeah. And then another comment, each of my 3 questions were addressed completely in this presentation. Excellent work. And I had no idea we had local porcupines. And I think with that, that wraps up our questions here. Oh, here we go. We've got an incoming. The LiDAR generated ladder fuels map looks fascinating. Would it be reasonable to say that the ladder fuels map also tells us something about understory canopy structure complexity?
It does. I think that was from Michelle Geary, if I saw right. Good question. So it does. And what's neat is we were recently funded for 3 years from California Fish and Wildlife to do post-fire forest management, and that requires a monitoring component. So we have developed this really cool forest monitoring program where we're co-locating vegetation plots with wildlife and climate monitoring. So we're looking at herps, we're looking at mammals, we're looking at birds on top of the vegetation and soils, et cetera. And in order to go find where we're going to put our plots, I used that ladder fuel map, and within our thinning treatment areas went, okay, here's where the fuels are the heaviest. Let's go put plots in these areas. And as we all know, remote sensing doesn't have all the answers. So when you get there, your ladder fuel complexity could be different. It could be Doug fir, it could be stunted trees that you want to keep and not thin. It could be a shrub layer from succession. You get your shrubs and then your forest canopy. So the one thing that's missing from that is more of the biological information that goes with it. So we're in the process now of talking about how we can carry this further, do some ground truthing. Maybe there's other metrics from the LiDAR layer that we can pull from to get at more of the composition in the understory as far as the species go. But yeah, it definitely shows you where there's more layering taking place, and whether or not that's a place you want to actually manage, you have to go there and see right now. But maybe we'll have remote sensing products in the future to tell us more.
Excellent. And then a follow-up question of, are you putting light monitoring equipment in the monitoring plots? It would be interesting to see how understory light environments change with canopy structure.
My mute button went away for a second. Yes, well, so we're indirectly monitoring light. We're not using any like Lycor wands or anything. However, we could borrow some of that equipment and run those. How we're indirectly looking at light is by taking canopy estimates. You also get some information about light by your herbaceous sampling. So the different herbaceous plants or cover of those plants might depend on how much light they're getting. We are collecting temperature on various scales. So we were also awarded a grant to put in 2 eddy flux towers at Pepperwood, which are essentially these really tall towers that are, I love it. They monitor like the metabolism of forests essentially. So like how much carbon dioxide is in the air, et cetera. So we're taking temperatures above canopy with those towers. Those will be going in a couple years. And then we're taking temperatures under the canopy. And then we're also taking temperatures at the ground level and even under the litter and duff to get a sense of that thermal profile. And that lower sub-canopy thermal profile could also be affected by light. And then we also use a densitometer to get, plot level percent cover of vegetation above your head. So indirectly.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. And I think at this point that wraps up our questions. And I would just like to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Michelle, for a great presentation. And I invite you all to check out our website. We do have some great upcoming webinars. A few were mentioned today. Our next one is on August 20th with our president and CEO, Lisa Micheli, who will be speaking more about large landscape conservation in the lens of climate adaptation in Mediterranean ecosystems. And then we also have a class later this month, immunity boosting medicinal plants with a local herbalist, Autumn Summers. So if you want to learn a bit about how like elderberry and fire cider could keep you well this fall and winter, that could be a fun class for you. And check out our social media accounts. That's a great way to stay posted on upcoming events and interesting research and Pepperwood in the news. And our YouTube channel will have this webinar as well as all of our others on it that you can explore. So yeah, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your week, everybody. Thanks, Michelle.